what I typically tell my students and people that I teach is Elon Musk said, with AI and the advancement of information gathering, you can get any information you want about anything now. It's at your fingertips. But what you won't get is perspective and an understanding and how that might actually influence your decision making. And that's what you get through these interactions at places like AOMPT and by talking to people who've been there before.
Excited to bring on today's guests. We welcome Dr. Chad Cook, a leading figure in physical therapy research, education, and clinical practice. With his work spanning both academia and hands-on patient care, Dr. Cook has tackled some of the profession's most pressing challenges, from understanding the nuances of social media and healthcare communication to addressing the heated debates around manual therapy. He's published extensively, blending evidence-based insights with a curiosity for pushing the boundaries of traditional practice. In today's conversation, we'll dive into Dr. Cook's perspectives on navigating social media's impact on PT education and the often controversial landscape of manual therapy. Prepare for a conversation that promises to be as thought-provoking as it is informative. Dr. Chad Cook on Hands On, Hands Off. Chad, welcome to Hands On, Hands Off.
Jimmy, thank you so much for having me here.
You are you're a busy person, so you're the last episode we're recording on the first full day, but you got a couple different talks here already.
Well, I think I got an award today, and then my talks start tomorrow. And then Sunday.
Perfect. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about this one that was near and dear to my heart that I saw first, which is media and how words and pictures and sounds get shared. So you have a session on social media and physical therapy. I was lucky enough to be asked to do an Oxford debate when they used to do the Oxford debate.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm just waiting for someone to someone steal the Oxford debate, bring it back from the graveyard. But your talk covers the quality of content circulating on social media within the profession. And my Oxford debate topic was, the prompt was, is social media hazardous to the profession of physical therapy? And that hazardous being a very key word there, because I was put on Team Pro, meaning I had to say it was hazardous, right? So all I had to prove was that there's some sort of danger. Doesn't mean it's all bad, but it could be hazardous. So what do you see as the most pressing issue around the quality of information shared on these platforms around a profession? And what drew you to study that particular topic and look into that and talk about it?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest challenge is the fact that everybody is an expert on social media.
Instantly.
There's no way to discriminate where you should be getting your resources, where you should not. So often what you'll see people, and you know this already, they'll identify that person that reflects their thoughts and their beliefs. They will search for them, they'll look for those echo chambers, and then they will absolutely fixate on what that individual says. And that person may be spewing nonsense and misinformation. So that's what we've noticed in previous publications, and we've recently done a scoping review. We've identified that as a big factor too.
Yeah. I heard a great line, and I might butcher the quote a little bit, but I'll get the idea, which is everybody's free to have a viewpoint, but not all views are necessarily equal. And the way I put that in context was I can have an opinion on how to put that fire out, and so can my dad, who is a New York City firefighter. And one of our opinions is probably more informed on the best way to do that. But when you're on these platforms, Chad, nowhere when I was signing up for LinkedIn or Twitter did it really quiz me on what my area of expertise was. It just, do you have an email address? Yes, I do. Can you verify it? Yes, I can. And then you're free to roam about the internet. So healthcare professionals, I'm excited about this, are increasingly sort of expected or are sharing information. We're hoping that it's credible. So what are some of the key criteria you recommend for clinicians and educators to distinguish reliable sources from misinformation on social media? We know how to do that in research, right?
Yeah.
We can peer review. We got a lot of peers and not a whole lot of reviews on the internet, though.
So Greg Kalchuk has a paper, and they looked at this in the chiropractic profession, and I think he probably said it best. If you can find content that is anchored to a professional association, then that content is most likely going to be more accurate.
Right.
The challenge is professional associations are more slow-moving, so frequently what you'll see are these social media personalities will post things first, and then it'll take a couple of months before a credible source will actually come in and post something that's probably more accurate. So definitely anchored to either a person that you know has done good work in this research or a professional organization.
Yeah, and that goes to domain authority. That's the way that websites are sort of ranked. So when you can see a .gov, a .org, or .edu, doesn't mean they're perfect, but it means most likely more care has gone into that review of that information. But a lot of times it's getting harder and harder, especially with the amount of the quantity. I mentioned before the quality of information, but right now we're sort of swimming in a sea of information.
Oh yeah, it's a pros and con, it's a pro and a con, right? It's a pro because you can get somebody who can synthesize that information down, who maybe that's their job, right? That's what they do. They're able to compile that information, but if they're not doing it right, it becomes a con. So it's a tough thing to navigate. I really think it is.
Yeah.
When we talk about this tomorrow, we actually do give the pros and cons because they're both.
Yeah. We talk about when I talk about this with organizations, like I'll team up with AAMT or other professional associations, and I'll say good news, bad news. Good news today. I don't know if you know about this. This morning, they announced October 25th as we record was the loudest day on the internet, which means the most information that was ever shared. Tomorrow's going to be louder, and the day after that's going to be louder, and it's just going to exponentially get larger and larger. So how do we combat that with organizations like AAMT? We said, well, how do we combat, the ideas around manual therapy? Well, I'm like, well, there's no principal's office. There's really no permanent record anymore that you can scare someone with. The only other avenue is create good information.
Yep.
I'm curious of what you think about this. So you talk about pros and cons, and I'm going to guess that you're going to mention two of these people. You got Huberman and Attia. So these are people with science backgrounds, right? Sometimes talking in their area of expertise and sometimes a few standard deviations away. But they have created massive audiences for this information, for good, for bad, right? So agree or disagree. I like to look at it and say, at least a pro in my opinion is people are at least hungry to find out more, right? Which it's a proof of concept. It's saying, hey, if someone... You're telling me this guy Huberman talks for 3 hours on one episode on one topic and gets 1 million views or 1 million listens? Well, okay, if you don't agree with what he's saying, the fact that someone would stick around for 3 hours 1 million times is fantastic. Why can't we do that? Why can't better information do that? So my guess is you're going to mention some of those type people because they have reach and they have influence. I always tell people it's better to be influential than an influencer, right? Aim at that. But when you see people like the Hubermans and Attias of the world get that large pretty relatively quickly, what sort of alarm bells go off in your mind?
Well, and again, pros and cons. The pros is you have somebody out there who has a background at least that's somewhat scientific. The challenges or the con is that they need to stay in their lane.
Right.
And that's, I think, what we've seen is they're starting to make recommendations in areas that they really don't have the depth of knowledge in. And that's a major issue. And we saw on Dr. Oz, remember him when he had a television show and he just started getting more and more as an outlier and looking at things to the point where it was very difficult to really even watch it and take him seriously anymore.
He had to apologize to Congress, I think I remember reading, where
I didn't know that.
He blatantly was like, but because when you get so big, you reach this sort of terminal velocity where you can now flip and say, well, how do I monetize this? And I believe, and don't quote me on this one because I'm just sort of winging this, right? This is anecdote, but it was something to do with him either endorsing or selling supplements that he was making claims about, and then had to sort of backpedal and say, well, maybe what I'd say about those things. But that's what happens when you have that massive audience. Now the goal, what you're actually doing, isn't informing. Your goal is to get more attention. So you're in the intention game and not in the education game and the informing game. Well,
we see this all the time, right? The social media influencers, you can tell when they've sold out, and it's all about product. It's about content. Content push, not content quality, and we could probably name several people just back and forth with the mics off that kind of fit that.
Right.
So you probably know this. We created the Center of Excellence in Manual and Manipulative Therapy at Duke to combat misinformation. There's misinformation on the left and there's misinformation on the right. The extreme views about manual therapy. and somewhere in the middle is probably right.
Right.
And so that's the approach. We're trying to be that source, a valid source at Duke, so people can go online and actually read what manual therapy actually does and know that they're getting a credible witness from that.
Yeah. Simple, but not easy.
No,
right, because
it's so much work. Yeah, tons of work.
And like I mentioned, today was the busiest day on the internet. Tomorrow's going to be busier.
Yep.
I often will use a graphic that looks, like a busy painting with a red line through it. And I said signal versus noise ratio, right? Because those apps are designed to keep you on there longer. The goal is to keep you there, right? And you have to sift and find the signal. What are credible messages amongst the noise? So you're not just talking about social media in our profession. You're talking about controversies and mechanisms in manual therapy. You get a little bit of a range going on here.
Yeah, it reflects we have an NIH grant, and it's a networking grant, and they have asked us to look at, what is actually happening when you apply manual therapy with a patient? What are the mechanisms behind the treatment? And it's a lot more complex than what people would think. And to really study it and do it right, you have to pull in individuals you would never think you would collaborate with, molecular scientists, cellular scientists, individuals who are sensory experts, psychologists, all of these components. So we've gotten all these people in a room, we're getting them to work together, and we're trying to design these mechanistic studies that give us a better understanding of how does manual therapy work.
Because that's the question, right?
It's still the question.
Still the question.
Yeah, it's still the question. Yeah.
So manual therapy, one of the most polarizing topics in PT. That's what I had written down.
Yeah.
So what's your take on why manual therapy has become so controversial? Is it because we're still asking that question?
I think it probably is anchored into two things. One is that philosophically we've created these theories 100 years plus ago. And
of why
it works.
Right.
And because we didn't have the science then, right?
Sure.
So we saw something work in the clinic. It made a big difference. So you had to backfill that with theory.
Right.
Well, in 1990s, we actually have the technology to sort out whether that theory was correct, and in many cases, it's not. And people are still advocating for that. I think that's one issue. There was an elitism component to manual therapy for a while, too, and I think it turned a lot of people off. Manual therapists thought they were best. They were the best clinicians. They were the best this, that, and the other. I think that part has really changed, but it's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah.
So I think it's those two things.
That's culture change. Because if that was the way 10 to 15 years ago, the only way to really change that is, unfortunately, slowly. It just takes a while.
And terming people out, right? Those people that are...
Right.
So, you've all day long, you've talked to people here at AOMPT, and you'll probably find that they're the most humble, friendly, easygoing bunch.
But that wasn't the case 10, 15?
I think 25, 30 years ago, it was a different story. It was there was a lot of flexing and a lot of, we're the best, we're trained the best. It's a privilege to be here type thing.
Yeah.
And I think things have changed quite a bit.
It's funny when you say that, maybe 20 years ago when we were figuring out what manual therapy is and what it does, we created a story, and then when we found out that the logic didn't back that up, we got a little nervous. Because that's how humans make decisions. We like to say and think that we're logical beings, but what we really are, and I study this in terms of what people listen to, watch, from my background, what they buy, we make decisions with emotion, and then we invent a story to ourselves in logic to justify that emotion, because I'm not an emotional being, I'm a logical being, but really we're big dumb animals, all of us. So I imagine that comes into play too when that logical story becomes shown to not necessarily be what you thought. Now my identity is rooted in that.
Yeah.
What do I do?
Well, it's an emotional response, right? It's like you're told there's no religion or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, it's if you have a narrative of what you believe is the reason it works, and that's the communication that you've had with your patients, and you've been told that you're going to have to change that, that's a tough divorce.
Yeah.
And I don't blame people for pushing back or saying, I need more research to tell me before I bite on that.
Right.
I know there's 15 studies that suggest that it doesn't have to be a specific mobilization, but, I don't believe that. And I understand it's because that's what people see in practice and that's what they learned. But we're seeing a slow evolution of that.
It's hard to convince somebody something isn't true if their life depends on it being true, or their livelihood depends on it being true.
Oh, especially that,
yeah.
But people are really... they're very fond of the philosophy they trained under, and
Sure.
they feel that it was best. And they put a lot of effort into it. So, it's a gentle nudge to get people to move in the right direction, but I think things have changed a lot over the last several years.
Yeah. Many studies focus on the if rather than the how of manual therapy effectiveness. How important is it to shift that focus?
That's a wonderful question. I think they're both important, right? However, I would say the if, does manual therapy work? If we compared manual therapy to this, that's been answered. And there's actually a recent study that suggests that we've answered that question 30 years ago, and we don't even need any more of those if questions.
Right.
The how and who it helps is still relatively unknown, and that needs to be studied further, and I'm hoping that's the next direction we go.
Right. In terms of clinical and cost effectiveness, how does the current research landscape for manual physical therapy stand, and where do you see the biggest gaps or opportunities? That's like sort of a future-looking question.
Yeah, so we know in the literature there are thousands of clinical trials in manual therapy. Manual therapy is as good as or superior to comparators. So in clinical trials, it'll look just as good as an exercise approach, just as good as a cognitive therapy approach, better than usual care. If you look at the second part of that, which is cost effectiveness, the literature is quite clear that a manual therapy-based approach, whether it's an observational study, an RCT, or whatever, is more cost-effective than especially usual care, medical care, specialist care, any type of routing of care where an invasive provider sees that person first. I know of 13 studies that suggest that. I know of 0 studies that say it is not cost-effective.
Wow.
Yep.
All right.
And that's the story we're trying to tell people.
That's good. I like that. How many AOMs is this for you? Do you know?
It's got to be at least 25.
Wow, really?
Yeah. And ironically, I put first-time attendee. I've gone every year but one time in 25 years. Yeah.
Wow. Why? Why do you come back?
I love it. This is where my family is. This is where I feel most comfortable. I don't even need to see the programming. I could just stand in the expo and talk to people the whole time, and it would be worth it for me. Yeah.
To going back to the first talk we covered that you're going to be doing is, well, why do you need to come here? You got LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. So the ceiling, the height and the width online, that's superior. But the depth, I imagine, is here, right, in person.
And the relationships. And, and drinking a beer with somebody and finding out a little bit more about them, their family, their passions, what do they want to do, and they asking you questions like, what were your pivotal moments? What were those hallway conversations that really triggered you to think differently?
Right.
That's what happens at AI.
Yeah.
It's just cool.
I mentioned earlier today the 2 biggest compliments that I get excited for, right, for what I do, and I imagine what you do. You tell me if this resonates. They sound very close. When someone says, I've never thought about that, in a day and age when you can access anything you want with a couple clicks, or not even clicks, man, I can just talk to this thing and it'll tell me stuff. So access to information has never been easier, right? So when you say, I've never thought about that, you've never thought about a thing I just exposed to you. That's a cool feeling. The only one that's a percentage point bigger is, I've never thought about that way.
Yeah.
Which means you have spent time thinking about that thing, and I just gave you a new perspective on that. That's got to be pretty fun when people say things like that to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's beautiful, by the way. And what I typically tell my students and people that I teach is what Elon Musk said.
Okay.
And Elon Musk said, with AI and the advancement of information gathering, you can get any information you want about anything now. It's at your fingertips. But what you won't get is perspective and an understanding and how that might actually influence your decision making. Mm-hmm. And that's what you get through these interactions at places like AOMPT and by talking to people who've been there before, who have done that.
So use the AI to pay your taxes and pay your bills and do all the things that you don't want to do, so you can save yourself time to do the art and the music and the research and the human things.
Oh yeah, and it can also help you with your grant writing. It can help you with give me some ideas that I wouldn't have thought about X, Y, and Z. It is actually quite useful.
It's wild.
But depth and perspective, it doesn't have that yet.
Right.
But we do.
Yeah. And when it does, we're in trouble. I think James Cameron and Arnold Schwarzenegger made a movie about that in Skynet.
I believe I've seen that movie,
yes. I think we've seen that one. Last thing we do on these episodes is what we call the parting shot. What would you want to leave everybody with? A sentiment, an idea, something to think about as we wrap up?
Okay. So I just donated to the foundation for research. And you don't have to donate much. We know that it makes a huge difference in moving physical therapist research forward. We started a foundation specific to manual therapy research, and I hope people consider doing that. $5, $10, that's it. But every little bit helps. So that's my request for people. Donate. It's worth it.
Sounds great. Chet, appreciate you having on the Hands Off podcast.
Thank you, Jimmy.